My name is Jim Patton. I am an emeritus professor in the Department of Integrative Biology and curator in the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology. And it's my pleasure today to be the interviewer of my close colleague, David B. Wake. We've been colleagues for more than 50 years in both units, the department and the museum, and it's an honor for me to be here for him.
The following video interview is part of the UC Berkeley Emeriti Association's Legacy Project, which preserves the recollections and reflections of Berkeley's Emeriti. In conversation with a colleague of their choosing, Emeriti are invited to discuss their academic careers, including contributions, accomplishments, and challenges, especially as they relate to campus history. This recording is intended to provide a personal record of value to the family, friends, and colleagues of Emeriti, and to document the history of the Berkeley campus as it pertains to the individual's department, school, and college.
All right, David. I have a series of topics, general topics that we can go through, and you can decide how much you want to talk about each one, but let's just start maybe by encapsulating your early history, the areas that you grew up in, your family, and how those early experiences might have shaped the profession that you have achieved.
Well, I was born and raised in northeastern South Dakota in a small farming community, small town, 326 people. Filled with Norwegian immigrants. All my grandparents were born in Norway, and so I was raised in a kind of an ethnic enclave. There were some Germans around and a few Yankees, but mainly Norwegians. And I spent my first 17 years in that town. Went to Pierpont, South Dakota. Went to school there. Went to high school and finished my last year of high school on the Pacific Coast in Tacoma, Washington, when my parents moved to Tacoma in order that their 3 children could go to college.
What university did you attend?
I attended Pacific Lutheran College in Tacoma, Washington, as did my sibs. It worked. We stayed at home. My parents could then afford to have us go to college. But those years in South Dakota were particularly formative for me. I went to a high school that had 9 students in my class. 3 of us earned PhDs and became college professors. So it was quite a remarkable town in the sense that education was highly prized and highly emphasized. And when I was about 14, my maternal grandparents came to live with us. My grandfather was a retired Lutheran preacher and an amateur naturalist and an intellectual. And it was a wonderful thing for me. I bonded closely with my grandfather, and he became my guide as a budding biologist. He knew the plants. He had Gray's manual of botany, and we keyed out plants together. So I early on developed an interest in the natural world.
So would you say that you started off to become a botanist rather than a vertebrate zoologist?
I did. Botany was my first love. When I went to college, I declared a major in history because I wanted to be a lawyer, I thought. Because everybody I knew who was successful, I had like 5 uncles who were lawyers. They were very successful, and I thought, well, that's the way to go. But I had to take a required science course, and so I took general botany. And I just fell in love with botany, and I knew I was destined to be a biologist of some sort. So then when I finally took general zoology, I realized that was really even more to my liking than plants. So that's how I happened to fall sort of into, by default into a biological career.
So you're very well known as an amphibian biologist, one who has probably the world's most authority on salamanders. So how did that start?
I took a course in entomology, and we had to do a lot of collecting for the course. We had to make our own collection, and we had to go in the field, and the instructor was a brand new professor. He'd just gotten his PhD at the University of Southern California, and he knew herpetology and botany and entomology, and was marine biology. He was a real generalist, and a real naturalist. And so when we were out, he'd go collecting with us, and when we were collecting beetles, I would stumble onto salamanders, and I was charmed by them. And he encouraged me, even though we were supposed to be making a beetle collection. He would say, well, these are salamanders, and he told me about them, identified them, and as I said, I was just charmed by them. And so I developed a close association with salamanders that just stuck. When I went to graduate school, I thought I was going to be a mammologist, actually.
Yes, I remember that.
And I started off my first year at the University of Southern California as a mammologist, and my putative major professor was actually kind of a lazy man, and he did things that were so strange. Like, for example, the first thing he had me do was feed toluene and blue to a porpoise in the marine world of the Pacific, and spend all day long to see when it peed. And after spending 3 days watching porpoise pee, I discovered that they just dribble it out all the time. So it didn't really, it didn't take for me. So I quickly turned to herpetology and became a herpetologist and pursued my first love in salamanders for my PhD.
So I know your graduate advisor was Jay Savage at USC. Did you go to him with a love for amphibians and reptiles? Or
when I applied for graduate school, I applied at the University of Washington, at Cornell, at Kansas, at Berkeley, at USC, and I got into all of them. But if I'd gone to Cornell, I would have gone in botany. Mm-hmm. At Washington, I would have done invertebrate embryology. If I'd gone to KU, I thought I'd become a mammologist, and at MVZ too. But at USC, it was herpetology, and Jay Savage, and I particularly wanted to work with him. But I tried out mammalogy just to see if it was my first love. It wasn't, unfortunately.
The world is better off with you as a herpetologist, my friend. Okay, so you finished your degree, your studies at USC, and then what? Well,
I got married while in graduate school to Marvalee Hendricks, who's my wife to this day, and she was younger than I was. We were both graduate students there, and we, a year into our marriage, we had a son, which slightly interrupted her progress toward the degree. But I finished in 1964. There were no jobs advertised in those years. You had to get it by word of mouth, and my major professor, our joint major professor, Jay Savage, had a Guggenheim Fellowship and was in Costa Rica spending the year. And I had been hired to replace him, so I was actually teaching his courses as an instructor. And so I just blanketed North America with letters of inquiry saying, do you have a job? And and I had to type every letter one by one by one. We didn't have Xerox machines. We didn't have computers. And so I typed all those letters, and it worked. And I got job offers and interviews, and it was amazing. I ended up with like 7 job offers. And in the end, I had to decide between jobs.
In your explosion of letters across the academic world in the U.S., did you include all of your publications? I mean, a standard CV and things like that, or were these letters just?
Well, the jobs I really wanted, I had published several papers, and most importantly, I had published my master's thesis, and it was a sizable publication in a good journal, and so I had something to go on, and I had another paper that had just come out, which had the grand title, "The Salamanders of South America." Now, there are hardly any salamanders in South America, but it's a very big place, so that seemed grand. Yes, I did that.
And you had done field work in South America by then?
I had done field work in South America by then, yes. So I got these job offers, and finally I was choosing between San Diego State, the Pomona colleges, and the University of Chicago. So good opportunities, But in the end, even though it would have been better for Marvelly, who was still in graduate school, to stay near USC, we decided jointly it was better to go for the big time and try Chicago. And so my first job was at the University of Chicago.
And when did you start there?
1964, without a postdoc. There weren't really very many postdocs in those days in our field. So yes, so there I was, starting right off, and they gave me the semester free from teaching, which was amazing. None of the other places would have done that. I was treated wonderfully well at Chicago.
So you spent 5 years at Chicago.
5 years at Chicago.
And so
That's
relate
right.
to us how you became a candidate to move to Berkeley.
Well, Marvelly finished her PhD, and she got a job at the what was at first called Chicago Pier campus of the University of Illinois. It was actually located on a pier sticking into Lake Michigan. And then they built a new campus on the near west side of Chicago. So she had an office and a lab in a brand new building there, and was appointed an assistant professor at the University of Illinois. So we both had secure jobs, or not secure in the sense they weren't tenured yet, but we had jobs. And hers was not really to her liking. She wasn't treated all that well. But I was pretty happy at Chicago. And then one day I got a phone call, just out of the blue, and the person on the other end said, "This is Pearson at Berkeley. How would you like to come out and give us a seminar?" And it's as simple as that, And Penny Pearson, who is the director of the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology, which I'll call MVZ, as we all do, had me come out for a seminar, and I thought it was just a standard seminar, and he met me at the airport. It was in April, and it was beautiful weather, and it was just beautiful out, and he said, "I'd like you to stay at our house out in Orinda." So that was great. So he took me right from SFO out to his home in Orinda, and stayed there with them. It was a wonderful family, and they were so nice and gentle and pleasant, and took me in next morning to the campus. We stopped in Tilden Park on the way in, so I could find a salamander, and the first piece of cover I turned had a batrachoseps under it, so I was happy.
And that settled it.
Salamander. And when we got into campus, just as we were walking into the museum, he said, "Oh, incidentally, we do have a job open here, and I'd like you to meet some of my colleagues so that you can get to know you a little bit." And that was the first inkling I had that it was a job interview. I hadn't applied for the job. I hadn't known anything about it. And and he'd had me stay for several days. Gave a couple of talks, and at the end of the time, he said, well, we had a faculty meeting this noon. We're going to offer you the job. That came as a complete shock to me. So I went back to Chicago and talked to Marvelly about it. And after a few days, Pearson called me and said he'd like to officially offer me the job as assistant professor and assistant curator for herpetology in the museum. And he asked me about it, and Marvelly and I had talked about this, and we felt, well, we already had some investment in Chicago. I had 5 years towards tenure, or would have. This was a year before. It was 4 years at that time. And so I said how much I appreciated it, how much I'd love to be at Berkeley. It was a wonderful place for me, but I had a family to consider, and I thought that I'd better stay at Chicago. I thanked him very much for it. And about 2 weeks later, he called back, and he said, we've met and discussed this and talked to the dean, and we've decided that we'll offer you a tenure position as associate professor. And that made all the difference. And I said, of course, I'll accept. And so I had this wonderful period of exhilaration because I was just beginning to think about tenure, and here it had happened without any effort on my part, and I couldn't believe it. So, in short, that settled it. There was nothing for Marvelly at that point, and she said, I'm willing to take my chances. I think I have enough confidence, enough self-confidence in my, that I'll be able to work out something when we got out there. And as it turned out, by the time that we were searching for houses in Berkeley, the next year, it was a full year because I said I couldn't come for a year. I had too many commitments with students and things like that. Berkeley offered her a teaching position. It wasn't an assistant professorship, but it became one within a few years' time. 1969 is when we came to Berkeley, in the fall of 1969.
So Oliver Pearson was the director of the museum
Oliver Pearson, known to everybody as Painey, was the director of the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology at that time, and he let it be known that he was not going to be a long-term director. He made that clear to us all. There were at that time 5 curators, including Pearson, and then much more rapidly than any of us realized, he resigned as director. It was just in my end of my second year at Berkeley, and so there was, we immediately wondered what was going to happen with the directorship. The dean called me in and said, we'd like you to be the director. And so that came as a great shock to me. I was an associate professor at that point, so I had tenure, but I had not yet become a full professor. But the museum was filled with young people. Jim Patton had arrived. Jim was there 6 months before I got there. So Jim was there. Bill Lideker, Ned Johnson, both young early in their career. And then we had some senior people, Bob Stebbins, Starker Leopold, Frank Patelka. So there were both junior and senior people around. And I obviously thought that some of those senior people would have been selected, but for various reasons, each of them was not considered to be the director. And I understand in retrospect now why that was the case. But I became the director at that point and remained the director for a shocking 26 years.
That's unusual in the university's administrative hierarchy, isn't it? Aren't directors of units like the museum appointed for a 5-year term or something like that?
Right, it is usually a 5-year term or even less. I think chairs are 3 years and directors are 5 is normal. And for one reason or another, there always seemed to be some reason for me to continue. And so I was asked again and again to continue. And then at some point, it became clear that the museum had to marshal all its strength to maintain its position during the reorganization that took place starting around 1980. So by that time, I had been director for about 8 years, and then from that point on, it was a time of critical reorganization and reassessment of the whole biology program at Berkeley, and I became deeply immersed in that.
But I want to talk about your role in the biology reorganization in a second. But just to follow up on the directorship issue, when Pearson, the interval of time, he was director for what, 4 or 5?
I think for 5 years,
something
total,
like
yeah.
that. So his role was to make a transition for the museum.
Right.
And so that's why, he targeted you in part to bring in. But you had a vision for the museum that you conceptualized early on and followed. And so can you talk about that at all?
Yes. Now, the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology is an unusual place because at that point, Pearson was only the 3rd director. It had been founded in 1908 by Joseph Grinnell was the founding director, and Joseph Grinnell was handpicked by Annie Alexander, who was a renowned patroness of the sciences at Berkeley, and she found and selected Joseph Grinnell, who was then at Throop Institute, which is a precursor of Caltech, and brought him to the president of the university and said, if you hire Joseph Grinnell, I will establish a museum of vertebrate zoology, and we'll do this and this, and I will pay the expenses on this basis into the future. And so she laid it out very clearly. It's all laid out in documents that are far too detailed to go into here. So Joseph Grinnell had this vision, which Annie Alexander liked, and he carried on until his death in 1939. From 1908 to 1939, and he was succeeded by his graduate student, Alden Miller, who'd gotten a PhD here in about 34, I think, something like that, and was an ornithologist and a renowned biologist in his own, very distinguished man of considerable accomplishment. And he stayed on as director until his death, early death, and that was about 25 years later. And then he was succeeded by Pearson. So they'd had this history of people, but frankly, the museum had become a little bit stodgy. They're set in their ways. They were still living in the Grinnell period. The ideas of 1908, Grinnell's ideas were very forward-looking, actually. I don't mean that they're bad in any way or that they even became outmoded. I've often like to think about the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology and its program, and even my own program, as kind of like an onion. You keep accreting layers on the outside. You keep adding things and adding things and adding things. And you never give up what you started with. And I saw as my role taking this really well-established, well-organized, well-operational, an operational system, and further developing it. And Painey Pearson had started this by developing methods that hadn't been used previously. For example, cytology, comparative cytology, had become very big in biology, in evolutionary biology at that point. And he reached out and got Jim Patton, who is a pioneer in vertebrate cytology, as an assistant professor and assistant curator in the museum, just before I came. And then we had a postdoc, George Gorman, who was who was an active participant in that, publishing lots of papers. Jim and George were very active in their respective fields. George was a herpetologist and a postdoc. So that was already started, and the idea that we could somehow develop further. The 1960s were a period of enormous change in evolutionary biology, with the development of new methods and new techniques. We were particularly interested in developing an allozyme capability, and Painey was all in favor of doing that. But that was something that I really wanted to see us do, and see us work together to form common labs, labs in which we could work together, bring in postdocs, graduate students, and modernize the whole operation while not giving up what we'd done before. So my vision for the museum was to see it become a destination for young evolutionary biologists in many fields, and I'm happy to say that's really has come to be the case, and it did develop into that.
But beyond the destination for young evolutionary biologists, I think that, to my mind, part of your vision was to place the museum as kind of the exemplar for other institutions, both in this country and abroad, to follow.
Yes.
That the museum is more than just the sum of its parts. It's an organization that should play a larger role in the community of vertebrate systematic biology.
That was definitely part of my vision, and part of I think the shared vision that we had, that the faculty in the museum had for the institution. We saw it as an institution that could become a role model for others, and we tried to develop methods and even new collections. So for example, we developed a frozen tissue collection. I was really surprised here just 2 weeks ago to get some facts and figures, and to discover that our amphibian collection has the largest frozen tissue collection of any collection in the world for amphibians. And I know that we stand very high in birds and mammals as well, and reptiles. So that's worked. It has really become a role model, and many other institutions have followed our lead in that respect.
Yeah, but also the information that's contained in the specimens and in the
yes, we've tried to get as much information about every specimen as we possibly could. But
to make that publicly available,
and that's another thing that we did, was we became that was an early goal, was to make all of our information publicly available, so that MVZ became the first museum to become fully digitized. And in fact, our mammal collection was the first digitized collection, I think, that went online. That was about 1980.
You had mentioned earlier your involvement in reorganization of the biological sciences on campus. I know you played a seminal role in that. Can you explain to us what that role was and what came of the reorganization, why it was instituted, and so forth?
We could talk a long time about the reorganization because it was really important for the Berkeley campus and for the biological sciences at the Berkeley campus. Basically, in the late 1970s, there was a lot of concern that Berkeley was falling behind in some major areas. Not so much in evolutionary biology, where we were doing pretty well. The zoology and botany departments were ranked #1 in the country still, but molecular biologists were feeling that they didn't have a central role to play on campus, that they're captured by the old kind of biology. That was their feeling. And so they were agitating to reorganize. So I became part of what became known as the infamous Gang of Four. And that was 4 faculty members representing 4 different areas of biology. And I was to represent basically organismal, evolutionary biology, and ecology. I thought I had an enormous area to cover. The other organismal biologist was, of all things, Dan Koshland, because he worked on bacteria. But Dan Koshland was a chemist in my eyes, not a biochemist, a chemist. His PhD was in chemistry. But there were people, and then Alex Glazer, molecular biologist, and Milt Schroth, a plant pathologist. All of them worked on prokaryotes. So I had all of the eukaryotes to me. And we started meeting in Sirius in 1980, and we broke protocol and we went over to University Hall, which was then the office of the president. We met with the vice president and made the campus furious when they found out about it. But Dan Koshland, who was the chair of the committee, did not stand on protocol. And we urged the university to go for a major rebuild of biology at Berkeley. And that would be new buildings, lots of new buildings, and accompanied by a general reorganization. Suffice it to say that this was just the start of what ended up being about a 20-year odyssey. It was about 1994 that we finally moved into the renovated Valley Life Sciences building. So it took, and I was deeply involved in that for about 15 years. And you got involved very much in the final stages of planning of the building and getting us moved into the building. And I don't think we'd ever gotten reestablished in the building without you.
You're kind, sir.
And the museum has wonderful space in the new building. The museum prospered in what happened, and I was glad to have been able to play a role, because I think it did benefit the campus as a whole. I think the campus is stronger in biology than we would have been had we just plugged along at the way we were going. We did need a new boost. We got the new boost, and it's paid off. I think Berkeley is extremely strong in biology in general right now, across the whole discipline. And the department we're associated with, Integrative Biology, has added 14 new faculty members in the last 3 years, and it's now just a powerhouse of a department. I'm so proud of the department. It's a strong department. The Museum of Vertebrate Zoology is back to its peak strength of 6 curators. We haven't had 6 curators since
Peter Amesbury
Yeah,
in the late
since
60s.
the late 1960s. So I think we're in a very good position for the future now. While the university is facing a very stringent fiscal situation right now, and it's a tragedy that they are, because California is never going to be in better shape than it is right now. And it's to my eyes, it's a shame that we don't have better leadership at in the political scene. They're not giving us the recognition and the resources that they should.
Talk about what you have done on this campus relative to your research and your teaching and the kind of general development of the academic atmosphere in the department and the museum.
Well, I'm an evolutionary biologist, and I'm very interested in biodiversity science, as it's usually called nowadays. That is, fields related to whole organismal biology and the diversity of life on the planet. And I have, in my own work, I chose early on to become a taxon specialist. And instead of working with model organisms, I chose to work with what I considered to be a model taxon. And I think there are a lot of advantages in doing that. You can see taxon approaches in other disciplines, like, for example, Drosophila biology. Drosophila, you don't criticize people for spending their lives working on Drosophila, or on some other groups of organisms that, like mice, for example, where the house mouse is just the pivotal organism for which on which you based a lot of studies. So with salamanders, I picked a group that had about as many species as there were in my hometown, people in my hometown. And I thought, well, I knew all the people in my hometown, so I could keep all those salamanders in my mind at one time, and I could know everything about all of them. And that way I'd get a good understanding of how a taxon is evolving as a whole taxon, as a whole lineage. And that has given me direction and motivated my research throughout time. To me, by being a taxon specialist, it imposes a discipline on one's work. For example, if I were strictly problem-oriented, then I would look for the best organism to study this, and the best organism to study this, and the best organism to study this. But that it would be kind of disorganized in my mind. I wouldn't have to deal with what I have. I could ignore what I didn't want to study. Here, studying a model organism, model taxon, I have to study all aspects of the organism and go into many different details. And that's what I've enjoyed. And I've enjoyed the challenge, and it has provided a constant source of inspiration for my research and for my teaching as well.
So let's just digress a bit, because you taught, your primary course was a course in evolution.
Yes.
Upper division, undergraduate and a graduate level course that you taught virtually every year that you were in residence.
Yes, I did. I taught that for over 30 years, evolution course that was, it was enrolled at first by about 10% graduate students, and toward the end it was about 50% graduate students. And it became a requirement for first-year graduate students in our department. I wasn't too happy about that because I wanted it to be an elective for everybody, just to have the students who wanted to be there. But it worked out all right. I I thoroughly enjoyed the course. It gave me a great deal of pleasure and stimulation to teach the course, and I kept it fresh every year. I used a new reader, newly organized every year, changed it every single time I taught the course.
I mean, this course was famous for its challenging of students. Can you,
Well,
what was your philosophy in designing the course relative to what you wanted the students to attain?
My goal was not to teach them facts. I said the facts are in the books, and you're surrounded, you've got an excellent textbook, and we've got journals that are filled with facts. My goal is to help you work through the facts, to think. And I tried to teach them how to think about evolution, how to assemble resources, how to use the resources, how to organize questions, how to generate hypotheses. I really wanted them to think. And I said I'd be really happy if none of you took notes in my course, if you just listened to the discussions, listened to the debates, and learn from the debates, because they're ongoing, and so there's nothing about learning all the details of these right now, because it's a changing scene. It's an ongoing scene. You have to get in it, and you have to get in and swim, and that's the only way you're going to make it.
Okay.
That's what I wanted them to do.
We may come back to more of your teaching in a moment, but just since we digressed, follow up on your research question, your research outlook and this taxon orientation. I mean, so your program was really that onion that had all these layers.
That's right.
And you had to, so some of that, training of the different layers came as in your graduate program,
right.
But the rest of it came, during your, your profession here both at Chicago and then here. So how did you attain the kind of wherewithal in both your vision and your technology to achieve the sum total of those layers?
First, resources are necessary, and we had to develop in the museum a necessary, general laboratories that we could share. So we were space limited, so that was a big deal, and this is where I benefited enormously from your presence, because the two of us were the two youngsters in the museum at that time, and we were also the ones that were interested in developing new methods and techniques, and the others came in on it too, but it was really our initiative to get these new methods and approaches going. I already had NSF grants when I arrived. I had my first NSF grant I got the first time I applied for it, right after I became an assistant professor at Chicago in 1965. And I've been fortunate in having NSF support continuously since 1965. My current grant expires in 2020. So that's a long run. And it's important to have had that kind of underpinning. And I was able to stimulate my colleagues in the museum to get support too. And you had a very well supported program. Ned had a well supported program, and we were able to get support of that sort. And then we built on our ability to have postdocs. And I think the Miller postdoctoral program at Berkeley was extremely important, because we had a run of postdocs that were the best in the world, and have proven themselves in so many ways. They've just gone on to fame in their whole careers. And we put it all together. We have a strong set of graduate students, excellent postdocs, thanks to the Miller postdoctoral program. Good support through National Science Foundation, both with individual research grants and grants for the museum, and good questions, and questions that stimulated us and high productivity. We always were very productive of research, writing lots of papers, attending scientific meetings, giving papers. This all, I think, was part of the success of the program.
So one of the things, I hadn't thought about this before, except right now, one of the things that you basically instituted, I mean, it was a program that existed before, but you really made it a primary program of the museum, was the Wednesday noon lunch evolutionary biology seminar series.
And that still goes on today. We started that. It was already started when I came here. I think Penny Pearson was the first person to really start that, but we formalized it and began having top-line speakers, and it's become a destination for evolutionary biology on campus. We pack about 80 people every Wednesday for that seminar, even today. So what could be just a local seminar has become really a campus resource.
Yeah.
And I think that's really a critical part of the program. It does bring us all together and shows us what we're about.
And we ask our graduate students to routinely give seminars in that series as well as outside speakers.
We do. And then we have groups like Herp Group, which Marvelly and I organized Herp Group when we first came here. It's an evening seminar program, met weekly for a long time. We just celebrated our 50th anniversary a month ago. It's been running now. It runs every other week, every semester. So it's been a very successful program. We had a wonderful speaker last night, a young woman who's working on the highest elevation frogs in the world, a graduate student here, works on frogs that occurs at 5,400 meters, which is really high.
I didn't. So I know that that you've taken every opportunity for your sabbatical leaves to go to other places and expand both your research and your intellectual horizons more generally. Can you speak to that?
Yes. Marvelly and I have always planned our sabbaticals together. We tried to get in sync, and we did do that pretty well. But most of our sabbaticals were half-year sabbaticals, and we would go away. A few of them were a full year. The first one we took was to London, and the purpose of that was to learn electromyography, which we both used subsequently in a variety of papers. Our second one was to Germany in the Brain Research Institute, and there we spent a full year and developed a very productive collaboration with Gerhard Roth, a professor at the University of Bremen, who had come here as a graduate student, actually. And we'd established working relationships. And there, Marvelly and I did work in comparative neuroanatomy and comparative neurobiology in general. Then we also took sabbatical leaves at University of Colorado, at Harvard University, the STRI, Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, University of Costa Rica. And they were all very successful in my eyes. And it was during those periods that Marvelly and I would do collaborative research. We haven't published all that many papers together, but what we did do collaboratively came out of those sabbatical periods.
Don't leave the viewers thinking that you're a laboratory biologist. You are an inveterate field biologist who knows his organisms in some of the most remote corners of the globe. Can you speak at all to some of the experiences that you've had?
Well, my research has centered mainly in tropical America. That is, I've certainly worked a lot in California and the Pacific Coast. It's been, I guess, my major field area. But I've worked a lot in Mexico, Guatemala, some in Honduras, a lot in Costa Rica, some in Panama. And they're not that remote relative to a lot of places, but we got into the last remote parts of those countries. Down in the Panama Costa Rica border, for example, you still get into some pretty roadless tracks. And I was working on tropical salamanders, and the tropical salamanders are really unusual. There's only one major clade of tropical salamanders, and yet it accounts for more than 40% of all the living species. So it's undergone a great adaptive radiation, and I'm probably best known for my work on those tropical salamanders.
So
I've published most of my papers on them.
how many new taxa have you described that involved in a description from those?
Yes, well, my species descriptions I've always felt as they were on the side. I never got my research support for them. They were always something I did as a side project that I thought was something I was doing for the world. I've described somewhere over 100 new species of salamanders, probably about 110 now.
So
I haven't counted lately.
Your hometown has grown considerably in its population.
It has. It's hard to. There are now have gone from about 300 species of salamanders to about 700 since I started doing my work. So yeah, it's been a growth industry. It's ironic that the number of species has been increasing at the very time that amphibians have been declining around the world. And another area of my research has been in conservation biology, where I've been working on the declines of amphibians around the world and causes for those declines and documentation. And as always, I was interested in communicating with the public on this, so I established a website in the year 2000 called AmphibiaWeb, and it's become a very popular website, and we still are maintaining it. We have an AmphibiaWeb team, an international team of top flight amphibian biologists working on AmphibiaWeb. We meet weekly, and we keep it fresh and updated constantly. And their focus is, why are amphibians declining? And we know that the answer is there are lots of reasons, but among them are climate change and new invasive pathogens and invasive species in general, in addition to land conversion and pollution and all of the normal subjects of discussed.
So we touched briefly on your teaching this course in evolution that is a foundational course for the department. But you, as a museum curator, only had a half-time teaching appointment, basically, right?
That's right. Mm-hmm. I was paid half-time through the museum and half-time through the department.
And also, as the director of the museum, you got teaching relief.
In theory, I got teaching relief.
Okay.
That's right.
But in fact, you taught as much as a regular faculty member at least used to, because you gave the evolution course every year. You gave a graduate seminar.
Yeah, I gave
basically every year.
Yeah.
And then you had your lab group that met
and herpetology
weekly. And then that's right. You taught in the herpetology course.
I taught herpetology by myself for a couple of times only, but I taught it with Bob Stebbins, and I taught it with Harry Green. And then when Harry really took over the course, I stopped teaching herpetology and taught these seminars.
Yeah. So what do you think the role of seminars in graduate instruction in the department and in biology in general is and should be?
I thought that the seminar approach is a very good one because it allows you to go into specialized topics in greater detail than you would ordinarily. And it encourages students to think on their own and to make presentations in class and that sort of thing. So I always like graduate seminars. They've kind of fallen out of favor. I'm not quite sure why, but I don't see so many anymore. Maybe the literature is just too big.
Yeah, could
too
be.
much.
So I'd like to, maybe change direction a bit and talk about, your role, the role that you have played in the development of your science across the globe. So you've been very active in professional societies, president of several,
Yes.
and you've played very active roles in organizational units like boards of directors of various institutions. Can you talk about that at all?
There's a lot to cover in this area, but I have been very early in my career. I was very active in the Society for the Study of Evolution and American Society of Naturalists, and I became president of both of those societies. And then American Society of Zoologists was a group I've spent a lot of time. It morphed into the Society for SICB, Integrative and Comparative Biology, and I still attend their meetings every January. I became president of the American Society of Zoologists too, and then I've been active in the herpetological societies. Herpetologists are still fragmented. We have 3 major herpetological societies, and I've been active in all of those. But I always thought they should get together, but they haven't. And it looks like they're beginning to merge right now. So I conceived the World Congress of Herpetology and recruited the first Secretary General of that. It was one of the last groups to have its first World Congress. We didn't have the first World Congress until 1989, and it turned to be a momentous Congress because that was where the awareness of the decline of amphibians around the world first came to the fore. So that was a really critical stage. More recently, I've been involved in a variety of groups, some of them learned societies. I was honored to be elected to the American Philosophical Society, and then the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Sciences. But of those, it's the American Philosophical Society that's my favorite. I still play a very active role in it. I try to go to all of their meetings, and in my mind, that's the highest honor I've received, is election to that society. It's the smallest of the learned societies in America, and it's the oldest, founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743. So they've just celebrated their 275th anniversary.
David, one of the things that we haven't talked about so far, you've mentored an enormous number of students. I don't know what the count is, but can you just relate anything at all about your students as individuals, your students that you're mentoring, philosophy, what your goals were in training graduate students?
Well, I have been blessed with wonderful graduate students from my earliest days in Chicago. And I've had about over 40 doctoral students. And it's been a joy. It's really given me the greatest pleasure in my professional career to work with these many talented young people. My goal was to make them into thinking citizens of whatever country. I wanted them to be happy. I wanted them to be productive in their own way. And I didn't have I didn't have my goals for them. I wanted to try to see them develop as individuals. Well, a number of them have become professors, even quite distinguished professors at major universities like at Harvard and Cornell and WashU, University of Washington. The successes are there in terms of standard academic achievement, but I'm also very proud of my students who've gone into agencies or who've become successful parents or who've become teachers in small colleges. One of my most successful students became the executive vice president of Johnson & Johnson Corporation. She started out as an environmental consultant and became amazingly successful. So success comes in many ways, and the top way is for them to be happy and to have felt that they've had a productive life. And I'd like to think that the educational foundation that they had was important in that area. Postdocs are a different kind of challenge. When you have postdocs like Miller's, they're brought in with expectations of greatness. They're expected to go on and become great scientists. And I've had, I don't know, I've never really counted how many there are. I've had over 40 postdocs, but I think I've had maybe 10 Miller Fellows who've worked with me. And they've all become amazingly successful. Right now we're trying to hire one of them back into our department. So I've had productive, collaborative interactions with many of them extending over decades. With my graduate students too. I think of Jim Hankin, who got his degree with me he got his PhD in 1980. We still have an active research collaboration going into its 40th year. And it's been very productive. So, you know, the students have given me a great deal of pleasure, and I hope they've gained from the interactions that they've had in Berkeley. Most of the students have a very warm feeling about Berkeley. They feel that they've done well here, and they have a warm feeling about the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology, which is small enough so that we have a really familial sense of belonging to a place. And the students they carry that sense of belonging with them for many years. They never let us forget that they're still part of us, and we love it.
So, David, I think that we can end now, but I want to just ask you one final thing. I mean, you've been retired for some time, as I have. We both come into the museum, and we're both on campus virtually every day. Your life certainly has not changed any, except that you're no longer teaching. What is it about academicians that remain active?
I know, isn't it wonderful that people who are involved in the intellectual life can keep going just as long as they want. I mean, there's just no end to the interest for us. I look forward every week to going to the seminars. I just can't quit. I don't want to quit. When I retired, it was about 2004, I think, and I'd had some health problems, and I felt that maybe I wasn't quite as sharp and up to things as I should be, so I thought it would be better to make way. But then I retired, and I got the biggest grant I've ever had. and then at one time I had 4 postdocs all at the same time. A couple of them shared with Marvelly. So 2005 was my most productive year ever. I published more papers in 2005 than any other year, and I think right after retiring, I just threw myself into research with abandon and thoroughly enjoyed it. And we both publish papers regularly. I mean, I publish probably 5, 6 papers a year yet. And I've got, right now I'm describing like 10 more species of salamanders. And so you can just keep going. And there's no, you don't do quite the same kind of research that you used to do. You can't do the level of sophistication that you would like to do, but you have to do the mop-up work that people are leaving behind. You have to mop up the messes that people have left, and you have to go out and get that done. So I enjoy doing that.
David, it's been a supreme pleasure for me to chat with you this afternoon.
Well, Jim, it's always a pleasure to talk with you, and I cherish our long friendship.
Absolutely.